The morning of October 23, 2025, is not one General Motors will forget anytime soon. For months, the Detroit giant had operated under a quiet assumption that Canada, like so many other partners, would grumble but ultimately fold. After all, GM had taken billions in taxpayer money to transform the CAMI plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, into a showcase for the electric future. The BrightDrop electric delivery van was supposed to be the star, the proof that Canada could lead the North American EV charge. Then, citing weak demand, GM pulled the plug. First a suspension in October 2025, then silence, then the permanent teardown announced in early April 2026. More than 1,200 workers, the economic backbone of a town of just 14,000 people, were told not to wait, not to hope, but to leave for good. And GM's leadership reportedly returned to Detroit expecting a few angry editorials and maybe a stern phone call. They could not have been more wrong. The man who once ran the Canadian Auto Workers, now Unifor, has seen this playbook before. Companies take the money, make the promises, and then, when the quarterly spreadsheet blinks red, they vanish. But what happened 72 hours after GM's permanent closure announcement was unlike anything in the history of Canada-US auto relations. Ottawa did not send a diplomatic note. There was no polite request for a meeting. Instead, Industry Minister Melanie Joly and Finance Minister François-Philippe dropped a hammer that echoed from the Windsor border to the Chicago assembly lines. The federal government slashed nearly 25% of GM's duty-free import quota. Let that sink in. Every single US-built GM vehicle destined for the Canadian market would now face a 25% retaliatory tariff. Overnight, a Chevrolet Silverado or a Cadillac Escalade crossing into Canada saw its costs explode. And Stellantis, which had shifted Jeep production to Illinois, was hit even harder. Its duty-free export privileges cut by as much as 50%. This was not a tantrum. This was a calculated, strategic, legally precise response to a breach of trust. To understand the shock inside the Renaissance Center, GM's Detroit headquarters, you have to go back to 2022. That was the year of the grand promise. Ontario and Ottawa poured billions of dollars into modernizing the Ingersoll plant, transforming it into Canada's first large-scale electric vehicle manufacturing facility. BrightDrop was not a side project. It was marketed as a long-term job creator, a cornerstone of the industry's future, a symbol that the EV transition would be built by Canadian hands. GM accepted every dollar, every tax break, every bit of public support. Workers at the CAMI plant retooled, retrained, and invested their own careers in that vision. By October 2025, when GM suspended production, the company insisted it was temporary. Weak demand, they said. A pause. Operations would restart at the end of the year, albeit at a reduced scale. The workers trusted that. They waited. They stayed near the plant gates, hoping for a signal. None came. By early 2026, the silence from Detroit was deafening, and then the permanent teardown announcement turned waiting into grief. Lana Payne, the national president of Unifor, spoke exactly what thousands were feeling. These workers had stood by the company through every high and low. They had committed to that plant, invested their lives in it, and Detroit had responded with a shrug. But here is where the story turns from tragedy into a masterclass in economic statecraft. Ottawa did not panic. They had been watching, analyzing, and preparing. Earlier in the year, Canada had quietly established a new mechanism called the Auto Diminishment Framework. The name sounds bureaucratic, but in practice it is a razor-sharp tool. Under this framework, any US-built vehicle imported into Canada faces a 25% tariff unless the manufacturer maintains active production in Canada, creates Canadian jobs, and honors its investment commitments. Keep your promise, invest seriously, and Canada waives the tariff. Break your word and the penalty activates automatically. It is a blend of incentive and discipline, and it is brilliant in its simplicity. General Motors chose to break its word, and on October 23rd, the government made it official. The joint statement from Champagne and Joly was firm but precise. Both GM and Stellantis, they declared, had acted contrary to their commitments to Canada and to Canadian workers. In plain language, they had breached legally binding agreements. The result was immediate. GM lost 24.2% of its duty-free import quota, meaning a 25% tariff on every US-built vehicle entering Canada. Profit margins for GM's Canadian operations evaporated overnight. Dealerships in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania began calling their regional managers in a panic. Stellantis, which had moved Jeep production to Illinois, found its duty-free privileges cut in half. But the move that earned the most respect was Joly's direct approach. She sent an official letter to Stellantis, short, cold, and unambiguous, reminding them that they had made legally binding commitments to maintain a presence in Canada. If they failed to comply, the federal government would claw back every dollar of funding. GM received a similar ultimatum. Joly then convened a meeting with Unifor workers, the Ontario government, and GM executives. The message was brutally clear. You have 15 days to present a production plan for a new vehicle at the Ingersoll plant. Not a vague idea, not a comforting promise, but a concrete plan with timelines, investments, and accountability. This is the moment when GM realized it had made an irreversible mistake. Because once Canada cut the tariff-free quota, the company suddenly understood it had no backup plan for the BrightDrop electric delivery vans that were supposed to be assembled in Ingersoll. U.S. dealerships were left with empty lots and no inventory. GM tried to contain the damage by increasing imports from its American plants, but now every one of those vehicles carried a 25% penalty. A vehicle that cost $45,000 to build suddenly landed in Canada at roughly $56,000. Dealers could not sell at that price gap. Customers walked away. Inventory piled up on lots from Toronto to Vancouver. Picture a GM dealer in Ohio right now, staring at sales targets he cannot meet, customers who are buying Hyundai and Toyota instead, and a supply chain whose costs are rising by the day. European and Asian competitors face no extra tariffs beyond the standard rate. GM vehicles, meanwhile, are saddled with penalty duties simply because the company failed to keep its word to Canada. This is not a hypothetical. It is happening right now, and the stock price is reacting not to an accident, but to fundamentally flawed decisions. And here lies the most painful irony of all. Donald Trump launched a trade war to bring manufacturing back to America. But instead of strengthening U.S. industry, he created an environment where American companies are tripping over one another. GM halted production in Canada, and the result is that American consumers pay more and wait longer. Supply chain managers in Detroit are now recalculating their entire playbook. With each day the penalizing tariff remains in place, GM loses millions of dollars. Restarting the Ingersoll plant suddenly becomes far cheaper than absorbing a permanent 25% tariff. That is the financial leverage now unfolding in real time. But numbers on a spreadsheet never tell the full story. Imagine a single mother in Ingersoll who has worked 12 years at the Cami plant. She has 2 kids, a mortgage and health insurance tied to that job. She is loyal to GM, knows every step on the line, and built her life around the stability of that income. In May 2025, she is laid off temporarily. The company says it is just a short interruption. She waits, hopes, applies for employment insurance, tightens her budget, and tries to hold her life together. Then October comes, the news of a permanent shutdown. No new model, no return date, it is over. She calls GM's HR department, asks about her pension, her seniority, her chances of being called back, but there are no answers. Meanwhile, a coffee at Tim Hortons is now $3. A family meal costs far more than it did 6 months ago. Rent has not dropped a cent. Bills keep stacking up. That is the reality at the center of every industrial crisis. That is why Joly's actions matter so deeply. Canada, she made clear, will not tolerate being taken for granted. GM accepted billions in public support. GM promised jobs, and GM broke that promise. Therefore, the government would use every tool available to ensure GM understood that Canada does not negotiate from weakness. Canada negotiates on principle. Workers deserve protection. They have given their careers to this industry. They deserve a government that stands up when corporations turn their backs on them. And then came the twist that no one expected. Within just 3 weeks of Canada reducing the tariff quotas, Detroit's entire mindset shifted. Ford Motor Company announced it was reconsidering its investment plans in Canada. Stellantis reshuffled its leadership, removing its Canadian CEO in a clear signal that the company was reassessing its strategy. GM quietly reached out to the Ontario government to explore the possibility of returning to Ingersoll. In an indirect, almost reluctant way, they admitted it. Perhaps they were wrong. Supply chain experts across the industry immediately began drafting new scenarios. If GM had to absorb a 25% tariff when importing vehicles into Canada, their costs would rise by 15 to 20%. If Stellantis lost half of its tax advantages, their profit margins would tighten. That led to the bigger question. Is it more viable to maintain production in Canada than to live indefinitely under punitive tariffs? Suddenly, the company's calculations shifted entirely. The number of jobs that could be kept in Canada versus the jobs lost due to tariffs became a completely different equation. And interestingly, Unifor began receiving phone calls not just from workers asking about their future, but from executives at General Motors and Stellantis asking, what must we do to make things right? That is leverage. That is how a government uses its power. This moment matters far beyond a single plant, because it reflects something deeper about Canada's economy and its national autonomy. For years, Canadian workers felt they had no choice but to accept whatever corporations demanded. If they did not, the companies would simply move production elsewhere. That was the power corporations held over governments and unions alike. Keep us happy, or we go to Mexico. Pay lower wages, or we leave. Offer subsidies, or we shut down. And that strategy worked for a long time. But that was before the current government began treating policy as a strategic tool rather than pleading with companies to stay. They built proactively, strengthening Canadian housing, boosting defense investment through Canadian procurement policies, and establishing a major projects coordination office, all designed to reduce dependence on American goodwill and on the unpredictable decisions of U.S. corporations. The auto industry is gradually realizing that this government will support companies that commit to Canada, but if they break their promises, consequences will activate automatically. This is not retaliation. It is structural principle. It is not anti-business. It is pro-worker, and it protects sovereignty, something Canada has lacked for decades. Do you think global corporations are not watching? When Canada cut GM's quota by 24%, when it threatened legal action against Stellantis, when it issued the 15-day ultimatum to GM, every company with operations here began reassessing. Boeing, Intel, pharmaceutical giants, energy conglomerates, companies that once took Canadian subsidies for granted now understand Ottawa is serious. Keep your commitments, hire Canadians, invest in Canada, and the government will stand with you. Break those commitments, and the government has tools and will use them. That is not a warning. It is transparency, and it is working. Businesses that once hesitated about Canada are now seeing a government that enforces its commitments, something rare in today's global landscape, where many governments hand out incentives without demanding accountability. Canada is now positioning itself as a country where commitments matter in the global competition for manufacturing. The Ingersoll plant has therefore become symbolic, not just because of the 1,200 jobs, but because of a much larger question. Are Canadian workers being put first? Is Canada's economic sovereignty real or merely procedural? Is the government willing to use its power in the interest of workers, or does it stand only with corporations? Joly set a firm 15-day deadline for GM to present a plan. Not a vague proposal or a comforting promise, but a real plan with timelines, investments, and deliverables. If GM is serious, the tariffs can be reversed and the reduced duties restored. But if they ignore it, believing they can withstand the political pressure, then the tariffs stay. That is leverage. That is what meaningful worker protection looks like. More importantly, it is already producing visible results. By November, just weeks after the tariffs tightened, GM immediately booked a meeting. Stellantis swiftly changed senior leadership. Suddenly, staying in Canada looked like the more rational option. When you cut off the ability to take subsidies and then walk away from a country, every corporate calculation flips. The previous U.S. administration's economic strategy relied on pressure and chaos. Scattershot tariffs that forced companies to operate in uncertainty. The current Canadian strategy is the opposite, systematic and predictable. The message is simple. Honor your commitments and you benefit. Break them and you face consequences. Corporations hate uncertainty more than anything. Tariffs they can